14 people vanished when a tornado destroyed Riverside Meadows Nursing Home on April 27, 2011. For 10 years, their families mourned empty graves. Everyone believed the EF4 tornado had swept away their bodies, destroyed them beyond recognition. Nature's violence explained everything, except it didn't. On April 27, 2021, exactly 1 decade later, an anonymous letter arrived at the Oak Ridge Police Department. 5 sentences that would rewrite history. 5 sentences that proved those 14 people didn't die in the tornado at all. They were murdered, and their killer had been living free for 10 years, believing he'd gotten away with it. Detective Sarah Morrison wasn't even in the office when the envelope arrived that morning. She was standing at the Riverside Meadows Memorial Site, watching 14 families gather for the 10th anniversary ceremony. Same families, same date, same ritual they'd performed every year since 2011. 14 granite markers in Oak Ridge Cemetery, each one empty. 14 names etched on a memorial plaque, gone but not forgotten. Morrison had attended every ceremony since taking over the cold case in 2015. She knew these families. Thomas Brennan, who'd been 12 when his grandmother Sylvia disappeared. Rachel Hoffman, who still kept her mother, Linda's last letter, written the morning of the tornado. Captain Marcus Dalton Jr., who'd been deployed in Afghanistan when his father James vanished, unable to return for a funeral that never happened. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. I'm curious how far this story has reached, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. This case took 10 years to solve, but I promise this story is worth every minute. Leave a like if you're already hooked, because what I'm about to tell you gets darker than anyone imagined. Morrison returned to the police station at 2:15 that afternoon. The envelope sat centered on her desk, placed there by the mail clerk who handled cold case correspondence. No return address. Postmarked Birmingham, Alabama, dated April 25th. Standard white business envelope. Addressed in Times New Roman font. Detective Sarah Morrison, Cold Case Unit, Oak Ridge Police Department. She opened it without ceremony. Cold case units receive letters constantly. Conspiracy theorists. Self-proclaimed psychics. Attention seekers claiming to have solved JFK's assassination or identified the Zodiac killer. Morrison had learned to recognize crank mail within seconds, usually handwritten, often multiple pages, filled with diagrams connecting unrelated events. This letter was different. Single page, typed, no diagrams, no rambling theories, just 14 short paragraphs that made Morrison's coffee go cold in her hands. Detective Morrison, 10 years ago today, 14 residents of Riverside Meadows Nursing Home disappeared during the tornado. You know their names. Their families still grieve. They were told the tornado took them, bodies swept away, destroyed beyond recognition. This is a lie. The 14 didn't die in the tornado. They were murdered afterward. Their bodies are still there, on the property. Underground. You need to dig. Check beneath where the maintenance shed stood. Crawlspace chamber 12-15 feet deep. They sealed it. Nobody knew to look there. I can't tell you who I am, but I know what happened. I've lived with this for 10 years. The families deserve truth. Dig. You'll find them. Someone who knows Morrison read it 3 times. Her hands weren't quite steady by the 3rd reading. Anonymous tips usually fell into predictable categories: vague claims, outlandish theories, attention-seeking drama. This letter was none of those things. The specificity of the location, the depth measurement, the tone, haunted, not sensational, guilty, not excited. Someone who'd carried this knowledge for a decade and finally broke. She grabbed her phone, dialed Captain Rodriguez before fully processing what she was doing. Sarah? Rodriguez's voice was rough. He'd been at the memorial ceremony too, had just returned home. What's wrong? I need a court order. We're digging up the old Riverside site. Silence. Then, based on what evidence? An anonymous letter that just arrived. It claims all 14 victims are buried on the property, underground chamber beneath the maintenance shed foundation, 12 to 15 feet deep. Sarah. Rodriguez's tone shifted to careful patience. We searched that property for weeks in 2011. FBI forensic teams, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar in some areas. We found nothing. Did we dig beneath the maintenance shed foundation? Another pause. No. There was no foundation left. The tornado scoured it down to bare earth. Why would we excavate bedrock with no probable cause? Because someone is giving us probable cause right now. Captain, this letter, it's not like the usual crank mail. Whoever wrote this knows something specific. If there's even a chance they're telling the truth, then we're reopening a case that devastated this community once already. If we dig and find nothing, we traumatize those families all over again. False hope is cruel, Sarah. Morrison looked at the letter again. The measured tone, the guilt bleeding through professional distance. I don't think this is false hope. I think someone who was there, who knew what happened, finally couldn't live with themselves anymore. She heard Rodriguez breathing on the other end, weighing options. Finally, 1 week. I'll get you the court order, but you get 1 week with a GPR team. If ground-penetrating radar shows nothing, we're done. If it shows something, then we excavate. But Sarah, this better not be a wild goose chase. The city council will have my head if we waste resources chasing ghosts. Gauged progress and strategized content structure advancement. Good start. I'm at about 900 words. Need to continue with the opening section to hit 1,000 words, then move into contextualization. I included the first CTA after the 4th paragraph as instructed. Now I need to continue building tension while providing the immediate setup. It won't be, Morrison promised, though she had no way of knowing for certain. Just a feeling in her gut, the same instinct that had made her a good detective for 17 years. She obtained the court order within 48 hours. Judge Marcia Stevens, who'd presided over the original investigation in 2011, signed it without hesitation. She remembered those 14 families too. On April 30th, 2021, 3 days after the letter arrived, a forensic archaeology team from the University of Alabama pulled into Oak Ridge with equipment that looked like it belonged on a Mars rover. Ground-penetrating radar systems, soil analysis gear, excavation tools designed for archaeological precision. Dr. James Walsh, the team lead, met Morrison at the old Riverside property. The land had been empty for a decade. No one wanted to rebuild on ground where so many had died. Grass grew wild. Weeds pushed through cracks in the surviving concrete. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, decorated with fading memorial tokens, flowers, photos, handwritten notes. "Show me where," Dr. Walsh said, adjusting his equipment. Morrison pulled up the 2011 site map on her tablet, overlaid with current satellite imagery. Maintenance shed was here, northwest corner of the property. Tornado scraped it clean. No structure remained after impact. Dr. Walsh studied the coordinates, then looked at the actual ground. Just dirt and weeds. Nothing to indicate 14 human beings might be buried 12 feet below. "We'll start the GPR scan now. If there's a void space that deep with anomalous density readings, we'll know within a few hours." Morrison nodded. She'd called the families that morning, warned them the case was being reopened. Their reactions had ranged from hope to anger to exhausted grief. Thomas Brennan had simply said, "Find her. Please, just find her." Now, watching Dr. Walsh prep the equipment, Morrison sent a silent prayer to whatever forces governed justice. Let them be there. Let this person who wrote the letter be telling the truth. These families deserve to bring their loved ones home. She didn't know yet that within 72 hours, that prayer would be answered, or that the truth would be so much worse than anyone had imagined. Oak Ridge, Alabama sits in the northeastern part of the state, 43 miles south of the Tennessee border. Population 9,847 in 2011. The kind of town where everyone knows everyone, where high school football games draw bigger crowds than the county fair, where 3 generations of the same family might live on the same street. The town spreads across varying elevation. Downtown sits in a shallow valley along Oak Ridge Creek. Residential areas climb gentle hills to the east and west, and the northern edge rises to plateau farmland. This geography would matter on April 27, 2011, would determine who lived and who died. Oak Ridge had 3 nursing facilities in 2011. Mercy Care Center downtown, established 1987, served low-income residents. Oak Ridge Senior, living on the east side, upscale, private pay only. And Riverside Meadows, the newest facility, opened in July 2007 on the northwest plateau. Riverside Meadows was designed specifically for the region's tornado risks. Single-story construction, no dangerous staircases during evacuations, reinforced concrete walls, impact-resistant windows, and most importantly, a below-ground storm shelter built in 2008 after the April 2008 tornado season, killed 6 people across the county. The shelter could hold 120 people, had emergency supplies for 72 hours, separate ventilation systems. The facility employed 37 staff members, 2 administrators, 6 nurses, 12 certified nursing assistants, 4 kitchen staff, 3 maintenance workers, 2 office personnel, 8 part-time employees covering various shifts. They cared for 94 residents in March 2011, ranging from independent living patients who just needed medication management to full hospice care for terminal patients. Marcus Tully became the facility administrator in August 2010. He was 43 years old, divorced, no children. His resume showed 15 years in healthcare management, previous positions in Georgia and Tennessee, solid references, appropriate credentials. The Riverside Board hired him to replace the previous administrator who'd retired after a heart attack. What the background check didn't show, Marcus Tully was drowning in gambling debt. Had been for 3 years. Sports betting, poker games, online casinos. He'd lost his house in Nashville, his marriage, his savings. The position in Oak Ridge was supposed to be his fresh start. Small town, low cost of living, away from temptation. Instead, he'd found new casinos across the state line in Mississippi. By March 2011, he owed $285,000 to people who didn't accept excuses or payment plans, and he'd developed a plan to solve his problem. A plan that required one specific element, a disaster to provide cover. He didn't create the tornado, but when he saw the forecast on April 26th, he recognized opportunity. Caroline Webb was the head nurse at Riverside Meadows. 38 years old in 2011, married to a high school teacher, mother of 2 daughters ages 11 and 13. She'd worked at Riverside since it opened in 2007, knew every resident personally, maintained meticulous medical records. She was the kind of nurse patients loved. Patient, attentive, remembered birthdays and favorite foods. Caroline noticed something wrong with Marcus Tully within his first month. Small things initially. Medication orders that didn't match doctor prescriptions. Supply requisitions that seemed excessive. His habit of working late alone in his office, door locked. The way he'd become tense when she asked about budget discrepancies. She'd mentioned her concerns to her husband, David. He'd advised caution. Healthcare jobs are tight right now. If you accuse an administrator without hard proof and you're wrong, you could lose your position. We have a mortgage, 2 kids. Maybe wait. Gather more evidence. So Caroline waited. Watched. Documented small irregularities in a personal notebook she kept at home. But she never reported anything officially. Never contacted the state health board. Fear of financial instability kept her silent. On April 27, 2011, that silence would become the worst decision of her life. The 14 residents who would disappear that day were Dorothy Elkins, 79, former high school principal, sharp mind despite her age, kept a detailed journal where she recorded everything happening at the facility, staff changes, medication schedules, maintenance work. She'd taught in Oak Ridge for 37 years, knew half the town. Her room was filled with thank you cards from former students, many now middle-aged with children of their own. Robert Jameson, 83, Korean War veteran. Everyone called him Bobby. He walked with a cane but remained fiercely independent, refused help with anything he could do himself. Proudest moment of his life was carrying the flag in the Oak Ridge Memorial Day Parade in 2010. His grandson had carried it in 2011, Bobby too weak from pneumonia to make the walk. He was recovering, growing stronger. The doctors said he'd be well enough to carry the flag again in 2012. Sylvia Brennan, 77, blind since age 52 from diabetic retinopathy. She'd been a seamstress before losing her sight, could still identify fabric by touch alone. Her room smelled like lavender. Her grandson Thomas brought fresh bundles every week. Thomas visited 3 times weekly, read to her for hours. She was his favorite person in the world. Linda Hoffman, 78, former librarian. She wrote letters every single day to her son Daniel, who lived in Seattle. Long, detailed letters about the weather, the food, conversations with other residents. Daniel kept every letter, had boxes full. The last letter, written the morning of April 27th, described the strange green color of the sky and ended. The news says storms are coming. Don't worry about me. We have that wonderful shelter. I'll write tomorrow and tell you all about it. I love you so much. James Dalton, 80. Vietnam veteran receiving hospice care for pancreatic cancer. Given 3 months to live back in February. He'd made it longer than expected through sheer stubbornness. Wanted to see his son Marcus graduate West Point. Marcus had graduated March 15th. James had watched via video call, tears streaming down his face. He was at peace now, ready. His son was deployed to Afghanistan, couldn't visit often but called every week. Eugene Morris, 85, advanced dementia. Former mechanic who'd owned Eugene's auto repair downtown for 43 years. Some days he recognized his daughter Barbara when she visited. Most days he thought she was his late wife. Barbara visited anyway, held his hand, told him about her life. He seemed calm when she was there, agitated when alone. Constance Marshall, 74, recovering from hip replacement surgery 2 months earlier. She was doing well, physical therapy twice weekly, walking with a walker now instead of wheelchair. Doctors said she'd be ready for independent living by summer. She was excited, already planning her return home. Patricia Rourke, 72, former emergency room nurse, now suffering advanced Parkinson's disease. Tremors had ended her nursing career 5 years earlier. She still wore her old nursing school pin every day, kept her certification current even though she couldn't practice. Her mind remained sharp, even as her body betrayed her. Raymond Tucker, 84, also with advanced Parkinson's. But unlike Patricia, Raymond maintained relentless cheerfulness. He'd been a youth pastor for 51 years, never lost his faith or his smile. Even bedridden, he thanked the nurses for every small kindness, prayed for the staff by name. Harold Vance, 88, bedridden from multiple strokes. Gruff personality, complained about everything, food, temperature, noise. But the staff knew he was lonely, scared. His wife had passed in 2007. His children rarely visited. He pretended not to care. The nurses saw through it, treated him gently despite his harsh words. Albert Cho, 82, nonverbal Alzheimer's. Former linguistics professor at University of Alabama, spoke 6 languages fluently before disease stole his words. Now he communicated through expressions and gestures. His daughter Susan visited daily, spoke to him in Mandarin, told him about her research. Some days he seemed to understand. Most days he just smiled. Vernon Mills, 78, chronic emphysema from 50 years of smoking. Oxygen tank constant companion. He'd quit smoking 15 years ago, but damage was done. Couldn't walk more than 10 feet without gasping, but he loved to sit by windows, watch birds. The staff kept his windowsill stocked with birdseed. Edith Sorensen, 86, transferred to Riverside in March 2011 from another facility after her aggression toward staff escalated. Advanced dementia with violent episodes. She required specialized care, medicated to manage outbursts. Some days she was lucid, recognized her surroundings. Other days she fought nurses, threw objects, screamed. She'd been a kindergarten teacher for 30 years. Photos in her room showed a smiling woman surrounded by children. The disease had stolen that woman entirely. Lucille Hampton, 81, wheelchair-bound from brittle bone disease. She'd broken her hip twice, her wrist 3 times. Even minor falls could fracture bones. But her mind was sharp, her spirit unbroken. She organized game nights for residents, planned birthday parties, kept everyone's spirits high. Her son David was deployed overseas, army chaplain in Iraq. He sent video messages weekly. She saved everyone, watched them repeatedly. 14 people, 14 complete lives, 14 families who loved them. Marcus Tully saw them as a solution to his debt problem and as loose ends that needed elimination. He'd been embezzling from Riverside for 7 months, small amounts at first, overcharging for supplies, pocketing the difference, then larger amounts, falsifying medication orders, selling prescription painkillers to dealers in Birmingham. By April 2011, he'd stolen roughly $68,000. It wasn't enough. His gambling debt still crushed him. Worse, Dorothy Elkins had noticed the medication discrepancies. She'd kept detailed records in her journal, compared actual deliveries to paperwork. She'd mentioned her concerns to Caroline Webb in early April. Something isn't right with the medication counts. I used to be a principal. I know how to spot embezzlement. Someone is stealing, Caroline. You need to investigate. Caroline had promised to look into it, but before she could take action, the forecast changed everything. On April 26, 2011, meteorologists began warning of a significant severe weather outbreak across the southeast. The Storm Prediction Center issued a high-risk alert for parts of Alabama, rare designation indicating potential for violent, long-track tornadoes. Marcus Tully saw the forecast and realized nature was offering him a solution. A tornado could destroy evidence. A tornado could explain missing people. A tornado could solve all his problems at once. He spent April 26th reviewing his plan. The maintenance shed had a crawl space he'd been secretly expanding for months, digging deeper during night shifts, reinforcing walls with stolen concrete mix, installing a reinforced hatch. He'd told the night maintenance worker he was adding storage space. The worker never questioned it. Administrators did odd projects sometimes. The crawl space was now 12.5 feet deep, 15 by 20 feet across, large enough for 14 people. Tully reviewed his target list. Dorothy Elkins, absolutely, she knew too much. The severely ill patients like James Dalton, their deaths would seem natural anyway, tornado or not. The non-verbal patients like Albert Cho couldn't report what happened. The dementia patients like Eugene Morris, unreliable witnesses, 14 total, enough to make his embezzlement seem like chaos from the disaster, small enough to be believable as tornado victims. The next day, April 27, 2011, he would execute his plan. And for 10 years, he would believe he'd succeeded perfectly, but he hadn't accounted for Caroline Webb's guilt. April 26, 2011, the day before, when life was ordinary and no one knew the sky would fall tomorrow. Dorothy Elkins woke at 6:30, same as every morning. Her room faced east, caught the sunrise. She lay in bed watching light paint the walls pink and gold, gathering her thoughts before rising. She was 79 but felt sharp, clear-headed. Not like poor Eugene down the hall who no longer knew what year it was. She reached for her journal on the nightstand, leather-bound, filled with neat handwriting. She'd kept journals her entire life. As a principal, she'd documented school events, student achievements, administrative decisions. Now she documented life at Riverside Meadows. Nothing malicious, just detailed observation, room assignments, staff rotations, supply deliveries. Lately, her observations had grown troubling. She opened to yesterday's entry and added a note. April 26th. Medication delivery today. Count still doesn't match paperwork. 15 bottles morphine sulfate ordered, only 12 delivered per driver, but paperwork signed for 15. Third time this month. Where are missing bottles going? Must talk to Caroline again. Dorothy closed the journal, slipped it under her mattress. Old habit from her principal days. Keep important documents secure. She had a feeling this information might matter someday. Across the facility, Robert Jameson was already awake, had been since 5:30. Old military habits never died. He'd showered, shaved with the straight razor. He refused to give up despite staff concerns, dressed in his usual khakis and button-down shirt. 83 years old, and he still believed in looking presentable. His room displayed his military service, framed Korean War photo showing a young man in uniform, medals mounted on velvet, Purple Heart from shrapnel that nearly killed him in 1951. His grandson had helped arrange everything last month, made sure every item was positioned perfectly. Bobby walked to the window using his cane, looked at the sky. Weather forecast called for storms later. He'd survived worse. Survived a war, survived losing his wife Margaret 5 years ago, survived pneumonia that nearly took him in February. A little rain wasn't going to ruin his day. He headed to the common room for breakfast, saw Sylvia Brennan already sitting at her usual table by the windows, her hands folded in her lap, face turned toward morning light she couldn't see. "Morning, Sylvia," Bobby called, same greeting every morning for 3 years. "Good morning, Bobby," she replied, her voice warm. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a corpse," he joked. Same answer he always gave. Made her smile every time. Sylvia Brennan's internal clock was better than most sighted people's watches. She woke at 6:15 every morning without an alarm, oriented herself by the sounds of the facility coming alive. Footsteps in the hall, distant clatter from the kitchen, the squeak of the medication cart Caroline Webb pushed on morning rounds. She'd been blind for 25 years now, long enough to map every room by memory, identify people by their footsteps, navigate confidently. Her grandson Thomas worried constantly, wanted her to move in with him, but Sylvia valued her independence. Besides, she loved it here. The staff was kind, the other residents friendly. Her room smelled like the lavender Thomas brought weekly. Thomas was coming today, actually. Tuesday was one of his regular visiting days. He'd probably bring lunch from Rosie's Diner downtown. Chicken salad sandwich, her favorite. They'd sit in the courtyard if weather permitted, and he'd read to her. They were halfway through a mystery novel, right at the part where the detective was closing in on the killer. In room 217, Linda Hoffman sat at her small desk, writing her daily letter to Daniel. She'd already filled 3 pages. Commentary on the breakfast, scrambled eggs slightly overdone, description of the cardinal she'd spotted outside her window, vibrant red against grey sky, concerns about the weather forecast, storms expected, but the shelter would keep everyone safe. She wrote the final paragraph. The meteorologists seem quite worried about this storm system. I've lived through severe weather before. Remember that ice storm in '93 that knocked out power for a week? This will be fine. We have that wonderful underground shelter Mr. Tully had built. Very safe, reinforced concrete, emergency supplies. Don't worry about your mother. I'll write tomorrow and tell you all about it, probably a lot of fuss over nothing. I love you so much, my dear boy. Linda sealed the envelope, addressed it to Daniel's Seattle apartment, added it to the outgoing mail pile on her dresser. Every morning she wrote. Every afternoon the mailman took the letters. Daniel kept them all, told her so during their Sunday phone calls. She had no way of knowing this would be the last letter Daniel ever received from her. 3 rooms down, James Dalton lay in bed, watching sunlight creep across his ceiling. Hospice care meant comfort over cure at this point. Morphine pump within reach, oxygen line in his nose, call button clipped to his blanket though he rarely used it, didn't want to bother the staff unless absolutely necessary. Pancreatic cancer had been brutal. From diagnosis to now, 8 months of slow deterioration. But he'd made it to see his son graduate West Point. That was all that mattered. Marcus was deployed now, doing his duty like his father before him. James was proud. So impossibly proud. Today felt like a good day. Pain manageable. Mind clear. He'd asked the nurses if he could sit in the common room later. Maybe watch the news. He liked knowing what was happening in the world, even if he wouldn't be part of it much longer. Death didn't scare him. He'd faced it in Vietnam, watched friends die, carried bodies out of fire zones. This death would be peaceful by comparison. Warm bed, morphine, kind nurses checking on him. Better than he deserved, probably. Better than what he'd seen in war. Caroline Webb started her shift at 7, began preparing the medication cart for morning rounds. 37 residents required morning medications, each with specific dosages, timing, dietary restrictions. She'd done this for 4 years, had the routine memorized but still double-checked every order against the charts. She noticed immediately morphine count was off again. Paperwork showed 15 bottles delivered yesterday, only 12 bottles in the locked cabinet. Dorothy was right. Someone was stealing medications. Caroline's hands shook slightly as she counted again. Same result. She should report this, should call the State Health Board, report the discrepancy, trigger an investigation. But investigations meant questions, meant possibly accusing Marcus Tully without concrete proof he was responsible. What if she was wrong? What if there was another explanation? Maybe delivery driver miscounted, maybe paperwork error, maybe another staff member with access to the drug cabinet. She decided to wait. Document the discrepancy, continue monitoring, gather irrefutable evidence before making accusations that could end her career. This decision, to wait, to stay silent, to prioritize job security over suspicion, would haunt Caroline Webb for the next 10 years. Marcus Tully arrived at work at 7:30, unusually early for him. He normally came in around 9, left around 5, but today required preparation. He'd checked the weather obsessively all night. High-risk alert still in effect. Tornado watches expected by afternoon. Storm Prediction Center forecasting numerous supercells, significant tornado threat. Conditions were perfect. He spent the morning reviewing his plan, checking details. The 14 names on his list. The crawl space beneath the maintenance shed, hatch reinforced, chamber deep enough that casual searches wouldn't find it. His alibi, he'd be in the main shelter with the other residents and staff, couldn't possibly be responsible for anything that happened. At 10:15 he walked to the maintenance shed under pretense of checking emergency supplies, verified the hatch opened smoothly, the interior was ready. Stacks of concrete bags waiting. ready to seal the chamber permanently once his work was done. He stood in the dim crawl space, imagining tomorrow. 14 problems solved at once. Embezzlement evidence destroyed when tornado hit the administrative building. Insurance payout he could access as administrator. And a clean escape. He could leave Oak Ridge in a few months, move somewhere new, start fresh with debts paid. All he needed was the tornado to provide cover. And the forecast promised delivery. At 11, Thomas Brennan walked into Riverside Meadows carrying a bag from Rosie's Diner and fresh lavender from the farmer's market. His grandmother, Sylvia, was waiting in the courtyard, face turned toward his approaching footsteps. "Thomas," she said, smiling, "I can smell the lavender from here." He kissed her cheek, sat beside her on the bench. "And I brought your favorite sandwich." They ate lunch in companionable silence. Then Thomas began reading from where they'd left off in the mystery novel. The detective was interviewing suspects, piecing together clues. Sylvia listened intently, occasionally asking questions when she missed a detail. Thomas glanced at the sky, darker now, clouds building to the west. "Weather's looking rough. You'll be okay here." "Don't be silly," Sylvia said, patting his hand. "They'll move us to the shelter if storms get close. That nice administrator, Mr. Tully, takes safety very seriously. We'll be fine." Thomas wanted to believe her, but something about the sky felt wrong. The color, too green, too ominous. The air, too still, like nature holding its breath. He stayed until 2, longer than usual, hugged his grandmother tight before leaving. "Love you, Gram." "Love you too, sweetheart." "Same time Thursday?" "Same time Thursday," he confirmed. He had no way of knowing that would be the last conversation he'd ever have with her. Across town, dozens of other families were having similar moments. Rachel Hoffman calling her mother Linda, their daily check-in call. Susan Cho visiting her father Albert, speaking Mandarin he no longer understood but seemed to find comforting. Captain Marcus Dalton Jr. sending a video message to his father James from his base in Afghanistan, telling him about the mission, promising to call again soon. Ordinary moments. Final moments. The kind you only recognize as precious when they're gone. The residents of Riverside Meadows spent April 26th doing ordinary things, Dorothy wrote in her journal. Bobby played checkers with Raymond Tucker. Sylvia listened to an audiobook. Linda wrote her letter. James dozed peacefully. Eugene wandered the halls, confused but calm. Patricia and Raymond chatted about their shared Parkinson's struggles. Harold complained about the food. Albert sat by his window watching clouds. Vernon fed birds from his windowsill. Edith had a good day, recognized staff, smiled. Lucille planned next week's game night. 94 residents, living 94 separate lives, unaware that tomorrow 80 would survive and 14 would vanish. The staff continued their routines. Caroline completed medication rounds, still troubled by the missing morphine. Other nurses changed dressings, assisted with physical therapy, distributed meals. Maintenance workers checked emergency generators, stocked the shelter with supplies. Kitchen staff prepared dinner. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Evening came. Residents ate dinner, watched television, read, socialized. By 9, most were in their rooms. By 10, the facility was quiet except for night staff making hourly rounds. Marcus Tully worked late in his office, door locked, reviewing his plan for the 100th time. 14 names. Crawl space ready. Tornado forecast holding. Everything aligned perfectly. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow nature and murder would converge. And 90 miles away in Birmingham, Caroline Webb's future self was already writing the letter that would eventually expose the truth. But tonight, on April 26, 2011, no one knew what morning would bring. The sky grew darker. Wind picked up. Far to the west, storm systems were organizing into something violent and unstoppable. April 27, 2011 was coming. The morning of April 27, 2011 began deceptively calm. Sunrise at 6:47 brought overcast skies but no rain. Temperature at dawn, 58 degrees, humidity 82%. Weather radios crackled with updates throughout breakfast service. 6 o'clock. The Weather Channel showed a massive system sweeping across Mississippi toward Alabama. Storm Prediction Center meteorologist hadn't downgraded the high risk, maintained warnings of violent tornadoes, significant outbreak likely. Words that usually indicated 2, maybe 3 tornadoes. Today would bring dozens. Dorothy Elkins woke with unease she couldn't explain. The air felt wrong, too heavy, too still. She'd lived through severe weather before, but something about today felt different, more dangerous. She retrieved her journal from under her mattress, added a morning entry. April 27th, 6:30 a.m. Storm warnings all night. Staff says we'll shelter if needed. Noticing odd behavior from Mr. Tully, he seems agitated, keeps checking his phone. More medication discrepancies yesterday. I'm going to talk to the state board next week if Caroline doesn't act. Something is very wrong here. She put the journal back, got dressed, headed to breakfast. The common room buzzed with nervous energy. Residents who usually ate alone clustered together, seeking comfort in numbers. By 9 o'clock, the Storm Prediction Center issued a particularly dangerous situation tornado watch, highest alert level short of actual warnings, valid until 8 p.m. Coverage area included Oak Ridge and surrounding counties. Staff began reviewing shelter protocols. Caroline Webb held a brief meeting with the nursing team at 9:30. If the National Weather Service issues warnings for our area, we execute the shelter plan immediately. No delays. Let's review assignments now. Each staff member had specific responsibilities. Caroline would coordinate the medical needs section, moving residents who required oxygen, IV medications, mobility assistance. Other nurses would handle different groups. Marcus Tully, as administrator, would oversee the entire operation and make final decisions about timing. Tully was oddly calm during the meeting, Caroline noticed. Everyone else showed visible anxiety, but Tully seemed almost excited. She dismissed the observation. People handle stress differently. Maybe calmness was his way of coping. By noon, the first tornado warnings began firing across Mississippi. Radar showed multiple supercells developing, intense rotation signatures, each storm capable of producing violent tornadoes, and all moving northeast toward Alabama. The National Weather Service in Birmingham issued their first tornado warning for Alabama counties at 1:15 p.m. Not for Oak Ridge yet, but close. 30 miles west, the storm was moving at 40 miles per hour, less than an hour away. Residents gathered in the common room, eyes on the television tuned to local news. James Spann, legendary Birmingham meteorologist, stood before his weather maps with characteristic intensity. This is a dangerous situation unfolding. Multiple tornadoes on the ground across western Alabama. We're seeing violent, long-track tornadoes. If you're in the warning area, take shelter immediately. This is not a drill. At 2 o'clock, the power flickered. Staff activated backup generators. Emergency lights kicked in, bathing hallways in yellow glow. At 3:15, the first tornado of the afternoon crossed into Alabama from Mississippi. EF3 strength, quarter-mile wide, destroying everything in its path. 9 minutes later, a second tornado touched down. Then a third. The outbreak had begun. Oak Ridge wasn't under warning yet, but staff began moving residents closer to the shelter entrance anyway, preparing for inevitable evacuation. Marcus Tully reviewed his list one final time. Dorothy Elkins, Robert Jameson, Sylvia Brennan, Linda Hoffman, James Dalton, Eugene Morris, Constance Marshall, Patricia Rourke, Raymond Tucker, Harold Vance, Albert Cho, Vernon Mills, Edith Sorensen, Lucille Hampton. 14 names, 14 problems, soon to be 14 solutions. At 4:30 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Oak Ridge County. Radar showed a confirmed tornado on the ground, moving directly toward the town. Estimated time of arrival, approximately 17 minutes. Staff sprang into action. 94 residents needed to move to the underground shelter. Many were mobile, could walk with assistance, but 15 required wheelchairs. 8 needed oxygen tanks. 3 had IV medications that couldn't be interrupted. Every second counted. Caroline Webb grabbed the PA microphone. "Attention all residents and staff, this is not a drill. Tornado warning in effect for our location. Please proceed to the underground shelter immediately. Staff will assist. Stay calm. Move quickly but safely. We have time." Residents began moving toward the shelter entrance. Steel door in the northwest corridor, stairway descending 15 feet below ground level. Mobile residents went first, staff helping those who needed support. Wheelchair users formed a line waiting for the elevator. Small freight elevator that could take 2 wheelchairs at a time, slow but steady. The sky outside turned greenish-black. Wind began to pick up, whistling through trees. Temperature dropped suddenly, from 72 degrees to 60 degrees in 4 minutes. Classic signs of approaching tornado. At 4:41, the tornado sirens began wailing across Oakridge. 14-minute warning before estimated impact. Most of the residents were moving smoothly toward shelter, but Marcus Tully approached Caroline with a change of plan. "Caroline, I need you to take most residents to the main shelter. I'm going to keep 14 in the ground-level storm room, the one by the maintenance shed. It's safer for those who can't navigate stairs easily." Caroline froze. "What? No, the main shelter is designed for everyone. It's underground, reinforced." "The storm room is also reinforced," Tully interrupted, his tone sharp. "And some of these residents can't handle the stairs or elevator quickly enough. Look at the line. We're running out of time. I'm sheltering these 14 separately. Mrs. Elkins, Mr. Jameson, Mrs. Brennan, Mrs. Hoffman, Mr. Dalton, Mr. Morris, Mrs. Marshall, Mrs. Rourke, Mr. Tucker, Mr. Vance, Mr. Cho, Mr. Mills, Mrs. Sorensen, Mrs. Hampton. Take everyone else to the main shelter now." Caroline wanted to argue. The plan they'd practiced called for everyone in the underground shelter. Separating residents made no sense, but the sirens were screaming, the sky was turning black, and residents were getting frightened. She made a split-second decision. Trust Tully's authority, get the 80 residents to safety, argue later. "Fine," she said, "but make sure they're all secured in the storm room." "I will," Tully promised. "Now go." Caroline shepherded 80 residents toward the main shelter. The last few wheelchair users descended via elevator. Staff guided everyone to designated spaces. Caroline did a head count. 80 residents, 29 staff members. Everyone accounted for except the 14 with Tully. The shelter door sealed at 4:52, 5 minutes before the tornado would hit. Above ground, Marcus Tully gathered his 14 targets near the maintenance shed. They trusted him. He was the administrator responsible for their safety. Dorothy Elkins sensed something wrong but couldn't articulate what. Bobby Jameson gripped his cane, ready to defend others if needed. Sylvia asked where they were going, disoriented without her usual landmarks. "This way," Tully said calmly. "The storm room is right here. You'll be safe." He led them to the maintenance shed, opened the floor hatch he'd been preparing for months. The 14 residents stared down into darkness, confused. "What is this?" Dorothy demanded. "This isn't a storm room." "It's a shelter," Tully lied smoothly. "Underground chamber, safer than any room above ground. Please, quickly, the tornado is almost here." Some hesitated, but the sirens screamed, the sky roared, and fear overrides suspicion. One by one, they descended into the crawl space. Bobby helped Sylvia navigate the ladder. Linda assisted Harold, who struggled with his mobility. Wheelchair users couldn't descend, so Tully helped them down manually, promised to lower their chairs after. All 14 in the chamber, confused, frightened, trusting their administrator to keep them safe. Marcus Tully sealed the hatch from above. Heavy steel reinforced with rebar. No way to open from inside. At 4:57 p.m., EF4 tornado struck Riverside Meadows nursing home with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The tornado, 3/4 of a mile wide, consumed the entire property. Buildings exploded as wind pressure differentials tore them apart from inside. Walls became missiles. Roofs peeled off like paper. Cars tumbled through the air. 2x4s transformed into spears, punching through concrete. The main building disintegrated in seconds. Administrative offices, where Marcus Tully's records of embezzlement sat in locked file cabinets, obliterated completely. Residents' rooms torn apart, belongings scattered across miles. The medical wing collapsed, the kitchen demolished. The common rooms ceased to exist, but the underground shelter held. Caroline and the 80 residents inside felt the building shake violently overhead, heard the roar like a freight train directly above, experienced the pressure changes that made ears pop painfully. Emergency lights flickered but held. Ventilation system kept running on backup power. The tornado lasted 43 seconds over the facility, 43 seconds of hell. Then it moved on, continuing northeast toward downtown Oakridge, where it would kill 17 more people before lifting. In the underground main shelter, Caroline and the survivors waited in ringing silence as the roar faded. Then came the screams, people realizing what they'd just survived, panic releasing now that danger had passed. Caroline forced herself to focus. "Everyone okay? Any injuries? Call out if you're hurt." Minor injuries, cuts from flying debris that had penetrated ventilation shafts, bruises from being thrown against walls during the shaking. But everyone alive, 80 residents, 29 staff, all safe, except Caroline's heart stopped. The 14 with Marcus Tully, the ones in the ground-level storm room. "We need to get out," she told her staff. "We need to check on Mr. Tully's group." They opened the shelter door. The site above ground was apocalyptic. Nothing remained. The facility had been erased. Concrete slabs cracked and upturned. Steel beams twisted into abstract sculptures. Insulation, medical supplies, furniture, personal belongings scattered across acres. Fires burned in multiple locations from broken gas lines, the smell of destruction, dust, smoke, pine, blood. Caroline climbed out, staff and mobile residents following. The maintenance shed was gone, completely. The area where it had stood was bare earth, scoured clean. "Mr. Tully!" Caroline screamed. "Dorothy! Bobby! Where are you?" Silence, except for wind and distant sirens. Marcus Tully emerged from beneath a pile of rubble 50 feet from the maintenance shed area. His clothes were torn, face bleeding from superficial cuts, but he was alive. He staggered toward Caroline, eyes wild. "It's gone," he gasped. "Everything's gone. The storm room, it collapsed. They were inside. I tried to get them out, but the tornado hit and He was lying. The storm room hadn't collapsed because there was no storm room. But Caroline didn't know that yet. She only knew 14 people were missing, and her administrator was claiming they died in a structural failure. "Where exactly were they?" Caroline demanded. Tully pointed vaguely toward the scoured earth. "There. The room was there, but it's gone. Tornado took everything." Search and rescue teams began arriving within 20 minutes. Firefighters, police, paramedics, volunteers. They found survivors in the main shelter, began immediate triage and evacuation, but no sign of the 14 missing residents. As emergency workers searched through rubble, Marcus Tully slipped away briefly, returned to the maintenance shed area, found the hatch, still sealed, covered now with 2 feet of debris that had settled during the tornado. Perfect cover. 12 feet below that debris, trapped in the dark crawlspace chamber, 14 elderly people huddled together in terror. They'd felt the tornado shake the earth, heard the roar, experienced absolute darkness when Tully had cut the power before sealing them in. Dorothy Elkins understood first. "He locked us in. This isn't a shelter. He locked us in here to die." "No," Bobby Jameson said, shaking his head. "He wouldn't." "He would," Dorothy said. "The embezzlement I discovered. He's covering his tracks. The tornado gave him the perfect opportunity." The horror of realization spread through the group. They began shouting, pounding on the hatch above, but the steel was too thick, reinforced too well, and above ground, the chaos of tornado aftermath drowned out any sounds. They were trapped, and no one knew to look for them there. If you're still watching, leave a comment telling me what you think happens next. Do you believe they survived down there? How long could someone last in those conditions? And hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. This story gets even darker, and I need you here for part 2. The first 24 hours after the tornado were pure chaos. Riverside Meadows had been destroyed, but it was just one disaster in a much larger catastrophe. April 27, 2011, became the deadliest tornado day in Alabama history. 247 people killed across the state. 62 tornadoes confirmed. 5 rated EF4 or EF5. Multiple towns hit. Thousands of structures destroyed. In Oak Ridge, the EF4 had killed 17 people outside the nursing home. Downtown was devastated. Residential areas on the east side destroyed. The high school's gymnasium collapsed. Mercy Care Center downtown suffered major damage but no fatalities. Oak Ridge Senior Living on the east side, every resident killed, 23 people. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Every hospital within 50 miles flooded with casualties. Morgues filled beyond capacity. Power out across entire counties. Roads blocked by debris. Communication systems damaged. At Riverside Meadows, the 80 survivors from the main shelter were evacuated to nearby facilities and hotels. Most had only the clothes they wore, everything else destroyed. Families descended on Oak Ridge, frantic to find their loved ones. Caroline Webb stood at the temporary command post, a tent erected in the Riverside parking lot, trying to account for everyone. She had her nursing roster, was matching names to survivors. 80 confirmed safe. 14 missing. The families of the missing began arriving by evening. Thomas Brennan, desperate for news of his grandmother Sylvia. Rachel Hoffman, driving from Tennessee, calling every 10 minutes for updates. Susan Cho, refusing to believe her father was gone. Barbara Morris, Eugene's daughter, holding on to hope that maybe he'd wandered away, would be found confused but alive. "We're searching," Caroline told them, voice hoarse from screaming names all afternoon. "Every agency in the state is here. If they're alive, we'll find them." But privately she was losing hope. The destruction was total. If the 14 had been in a ground-level storm room that collapsed, survival seemed impossible. Search and rescue teams worked through the night. Thermal imaging cameras scanning for heat signatures, cadaver dogs sniffing through rubble, volunteers forming human chains, passing debris piece by piece, checking every space large enough to hide a human body. They found remains, body parts, mostly unidentifiable without forensic analysis. 3 victims from the nursing home identified by that evening. 2 staff members who'd been outside during impact. 1 resident who'd been in the bathroom when the tornado hit. But no sign of the 14 missing residents. Marcus Tully played his role perfectly. He'd given statements to police, explained the shelter protocol, described the ground-level storm room and how it had collapsed. His story was consistent, his emotion convincing. He even helped with the search, showing teams where the storm room had been located. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was a victim too. His facility destroyed, residents dead on his watch, career ruined. He appeared devastated, appropriate given the circumstances. What no one knew, Marcus Tully kept checking the maintenance shed area, ensuring debris still covered the hatch. He couldn't risk anyone finding it yet. Not until the 14 were definitely dead. Then he could discover the bodies, express shock, claim he hadn't known about the crawl space. Below ground, the 14 faced their first night in absolute darkness. Dorothy Elkins had taken charge as best she could. Former principal, accustomed to crisis management. She'd organized the group, done an inventory of resources. Result, grim. No food, no water except what some residents had in small bottles they'd grabbed during evacuation. 1 flashlight found in someone's pocket, battery already weak. Medications, scattered doses in pockets, nothing systematic. Bobby Jameson's insulin, Patricia Rourke's Parkinson's medication, James Dalton's morphine pump, now almost empty. Air quality was the immediate concern. The chamber was sealed. Ventilation system non-existent. 12.5 feet below ground, 15 by 20 feet of space, 14 people breathing. "We need to stay calm," Dorothy said, her voice steady despite terror. "Conserve energy. They'll find us, they have to find us." But privately she knew the truth. Marcus Tully had sealed them in deliberately. He wouldn't help searches find them. Their only hope was if someone figured out this chamber existed and thought to look here. By morning, April 28th, that hope was fading. Above ground, search efforts continued. The FBI had arrived with forensic teams, established a command center. They brought cadaver dogs specifically trained for disaster recovery. The dogs hit on several locations, found 2 more bodies by noon, but 14 residents remained missing. Families refused to leave. Thomas Brennan stayed at the site, watching every piece of debris get moved, hoping to see his grandmother emerge somehow. Rachel Hoffman did the same. The families clustered together, supporting each other, refusing to accept their loved ones were gone without bodies as proof. Caroline Webb worked alongside searchers, guilt eating her alive. She'd accepted Tully's plan without sufficient question, had separated the 14. If they were dead, she shared responsibility. She approached Marcus Tully at the command center that afternoon. "Show me again exactly where the storm room was." Tully walked her to the maintenance shed area. Nothing but bare earth now, debris cleared away during search efforts. "Here. The room was approximately here. Foundation was only 3 feet deep, reinforced concrete walls, but the tornado—" He trailed off, gestured helplessly at the destruction. "Why did you choose these specific 14? Caroline asked, the question that had been nagging her since yesterday. 4 of them were mobile. They could have used the main shelter. Tully's expression flickered, just for a second, with something that might have been anger. Then he composed himself. Medical judgment call. Some had oxygen needs, some mobility challenges. I thought the ground-level option would be safer. I was wrong." His voice broke convincingly. God, I was wrong. Caroline wanted to believe him, but something felt off. The way his story was too smooth, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes directly, the way he kept checking the area almost obsessively. She said nothing, just filed her suspicions away, told herself she was looking for someone to blame because guilt demanded it. By evening, April 28th, official search efforts began to scale back. Other disaster sites across Alabama needed resources. Oak Ridge had been searched thoroughly for 2 days. The likelihood of finding survivors decreased with each passing hour. The FBI began discussing transitioning from rescue to recovery. Assumption: the 14 were dead, their bodies somewhere in the debris field, possibly scattered by tornado winds, possibly buried too deep to locate immediately. Families protested. Thomas Brennan pleaded with searchers, "You can't stop looking. My grandmother is out there somewhere. You can't just give up." But resources were finite. Other towns needed help. The search couldn't continue at maximum intensity forever. Below ground, the 14 entered their second night. Conditions deteriorating rapidly. The air had grown stale, thick. People were gasping, struggling to breathe. CO2 buildup in the sealed chamber, every breath reducing oxygen percentage, increasing carbon dioxide. Within another day, they'd begin losing consciousness from hypoxia. Water was gone. All bottles empty. Dehydration setting in. Dry mouths, headaches, dizziness. In the Alabama heat, even underground, temperatures rose during day. No cooling, no air circulation. People were sweating, losing precious fluids. James Dalton was fading. His morphine pump had run dry that morning. Cancer pain returning full force, no medication to ease it. He lay in Dorothy's arms, trying not to scream. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry you have to see this." "Shh," Dorothy said, stroking his hair. "You're going to be okay. We're all going to be okay." But she knew that was a lie. She could feel it in her bones. They were going to die down here. Vernon Mills had stopped responding, his emphysema crisis without his oxygen tank. He lay unconscious, breathing shallow and labored. Every breath a ragged gasp. Edith Sorensen had spiraled into violent dementia episode. Without her medications, her aggression had returned. She was shouting, incoherent, striking out at anyone who came near. Bobby and Harold were trying to restrain her gently, keep her from hurting herself or others. Albert Cho sat silently, staring at darkness. Non-verbal Alzheimer's meant he couldn't express his terror, but everyone could see it in his eyes. Absolute confusion, absolute fear. Sylvia Brennan, blind in a dark chamber, couldn't tell where she was anymore, couldn't orient herself. She kept reaching out, trying to find familiar landmarks, finding only concrete walls and other terrified people. "Thomas," she called weakly. "Thomas, where are you?" "He's coming," Linda Hoffman lied, holding Sylvia's hand. "Your grandson is coming. They're all coming. Just hold on." But Linda knew the truth too. Her last letter to Daniel sat in a destroyed mail pile somewhere, probably blown miles away. He'd never receive it. He'd never know what happened to her in these final hours. By April 29th, search efforts officially transitioned to recovery mode. Teams would continue combing the site, but without expectation of finding survivors. Focus shifted to recovering remains for identification and burial. Families were encouraged to return home, wait for notification when bodies were found. Some left, exhausted and defeated. Others stayed, refusing to abandon their loved ones. Thomas Brennan stayed. He camped in his car in the parking lot, watched every recovery operation. If they found his grandmother's body, he would be there. He owed her that. The FBI Forensic Anthropology Unit arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment. They'd used GPR at other disaster sites, could sometimes locate remains buried deep in rubble by detecting density anomalies. They scanned the entire Riverside property over 2 days, found several hits, remains of 3 more victims, eventually identified through dental records, found structural elements, concrete, rebar, building foundations, but they only scanned to about 8 feet depth. Standard disaster protocol. Bodies rarely ended up buried deeper than debris piles naturally settled. No reason to scan deeper without specific cause. The crawl space was 12.5 feet down, just beyond their search parameters. Marcus Tully watched the GPR scans with held breath, watched teams scan directly over the chamber and move on. Relief flooded him. They hadn't found it. Wouldn't find it. The 14 would die down there, their bodies eventually mummifying in the sealed environment. Months or years from now, if anyone ever did find the chamber, cause of death would be obvious. Trapped by tornado, suffocated, no evidence of murder. His plan was working. By May 2, 2011, official search operations concluded at Riverside Meadows. Final count, 6 bodies recovered and identified, 14 residents missing, presumed dead, bodies unrecovered. The county medical examiner issued death certificates for the 14 based on reasonable assumption. They'd been present at the facility during the tornado. Massive destruction. Multiple victims' bodies never recovered. Not unusual in violent tornadoes. Bodies can be scattered miles, destroyed beyond recognition, buried beyond detection. Dorothy Elkins, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Robert Jameson, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Sylvia Brennan, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Linda Hoffman, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. James Dalton, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Eugene Morris, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Constance Marshall, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Patricia Rourke, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Raymond Tucker, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Harold Vance, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Albert Cho, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Vernon Mills, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Edith Sorensen, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Lucille Hampton, presumed deceased, April 27, 2011. Funerals were held, 14 empty caskets buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery. Memorial services, obituaries, grief counseling for families. Life moved on, as it always does, even after tragedy. But below ground in the sealed chamber, 12.5 feet deep, 14 people were still alive. Barely. It was May the 2nd, 5 days since they'd been trapped. Most were unconscious by now. CO2 levels critical, oxygen depleted, dehydration severe, bodies shutting down. James Dalton had died 2 days earlier, May 30th. Cancer and dehydration together proving too much. They'd laid his body in the corner, covered it with someone's jacket. He'd been the first to go. Vernon Mills died May 1st, his damaged lungs unable to process the thin, stale air. Second death. By May 2nd, most of the others were drifting in and out of consciousness. Too weak to speak, too dehydrated to produce tears. Just waiting for death. Dorothy Elkins, stubborn to the end, maintained consciousness longer than most. She thought about her life. 53 years teaching, thousands of students, decades of dedication. And she'd die in a hole, murdered for discovering embezzlement. She thought about her journal, still hidden under her mattress in the ruins above. Would anyone find it? Would anyone understand what she'd documented? Or would her discovery of Tully's crimes die with her? Marcus Tully returned to the site that evening, May the 2nd. Search operations had concluded. Site was quiet except for wind-moving debris. He approached the maintenance shed area, stood directly above the chamber. He listened. No sounds from below. Silent. They were probably all dead by now. 5 days without food or water, limited air. Even the healthiest person couldn't survive those conditions long. Elderly people with medical conditions? No chance. He'd wait another week. Then he'd discover the chamber by accident, claim he was checking the site for insurance purposes, noticed an anomaly in the ground, investigated. He'd express shock, call police, play the devastated administrator who'd had no idea this hidden chamber existed. Perfect plan. Almost executed. Except for one variable Marcus Tully hadn't accounted for, Caroline Webb's conscience. Caroline Webb quit Riverside Meadows in June 2011. She couldn't stay after what happened. Couldn't look at the empty facility lot without seeing the faces of the 14. Couldn't work in healthcare administration anymore without remembering how she'd separated them, followed Tully's orders without sufficient question. She moved to Birmingham, took a position as a school nurse. Quieter work. Less responsibility. Less chance to make decisions that killed people. But the guilt followed her. Every night she dreamed about the tornado. Saw Tully's face as he insisted on separating the 14. Heard Dorothy's voice asking questions. Remembered the odd look in Tully's eyes. Had it been panic? Guilt? Calculation? Caroline began researching Riverside Meadows records. She'd kept copies of medication logs from her time there, professional habit, documentation in case of audits. She reviewed them carefully, looking for patterns. The morphine discrepancies Dorothy had mentioned. Caroline counted back through 6 months of records. Pattern emerged. Every month, 3 to 5 bottles of high-strength morphine disappeared from inventory, always coinciding with Tully's weekend shifts when he worked alone. Embezzlement. Dorothy had been right, and Dorothy had confronted Caroline about it 2 weeks before the tornado. Had told Caroline she planned to report it if action wasn't taken. Caroline's hands shook as she connected dots. Tully had been stealing medications. Dorothy knew. Dorothy was going to report him. The tornado provided perfect cover to eliminate witness, but that seemed paranoid. Surely Tully hadn't, he couldn't have, except Caroline remembered strange things. The way Tully had insisted on separating exactly those 14. 4 were mobile, could have used the main shelter. Why separate them? The ground-level storm room made no tactical sense. Main shelter was safer, designed for the entire population. And after the tornado, the way Tully kept checking the maintenance shed area, the way his story about the collapsed storm room never quite added up. Caroline had searched building records in June. There was no permitted storm room in that location. Plans showed maintenance shed, storage closet, electrical systems, no storm room. So where had Tully taken the 14? Caroline considered going to police, but with what evidence? Medication discrepancies and paranoid suspicions. Tully would deny everything. She'd look like a grieving staff member searching for someone to blame. And what if she was wrong? What if Tully really had made a tragic judgment call and those 14 really had died in the tornado? She'd destroy an innocent man's life based on circumstantial coincidence. So Caroline stayed silent, filed her suspicions away, tried to move on with life. But every April 27th, the anniversary, guilt overwhelmed her. She'd visit Oak Ridge Cemetery, stand before the 14 memorial markers, apologize to empty graves. She'd imagine what she should have done differently, should have questioned Tully more forcefully, should have refused to separate residents, should have reported medication discrepancies immediately, should have saved them. Years passed. Caroline married, had a daughter, built a new life in Birmingham, but the ghosts of Riverside Meadows never left her. By 2021, 10 years after the tornado, Caroline decided she couldn't carry the secret anymore. Even if she was wrong, even if her suspicions were paranoid grief, the families deserved to know someone questioned the official story. She wrote the anonymous letter on April 25, 2021, sat at her kitchen table, typed it carefully, printed it on plain paper with no identifying markers. Detective Morrison, 10 years ago today, 14 residents of Riverside Meadows Nursing Home disappeared during the tornado. You know their names. Their families still grieve. She hesitated at this point. Once she sent this letter, there was no taking it back. If she was wrong, she'd trigger a massive investigation for nothing. If she was right, God, if she was right, she'd been silent for 10 years while Marcus Tully walked free. Her husband David found her at the table, staring at the half-written letter. "What's that?" he asked. Caroline told him everything. The medication discrepancies, Dorothy's concerns, Tully's strange behavior, the suspicious separation of residents, the non-existent storm room. Years of suppressed guilt pouring out. David listened quietly. Then, "You need to send it. Even if you're wrong, even if investigators find nothing, you need to tell someone what you suspected. Those families deserve every possible effort to find the truth." Caroline finished the letter, drove to Birmingham's main post office, mailed it anonymously. Then she went home and waited. 3 days later, on April 27, 2021, exactly 10 years after the tornado, Detective Sarah Morrison received the letter. The ground-penetrating radar scan on May 1, 2021, took 3 hours. Dr. James Walsh moved the equipment methodically across the former maintenance shed area, laptop screen showing subsurface layers in real time. Detective Morrison stood beside him, arms crossed, trying not to hope too hard. 10 years of empty graves, 10 years of families without closure. If this letter was legitimate, if the 14 really were buried here. At 10:47 a.m., Dr. Walsh stopped the equipment abruptly. "Sarah," his voice was tight, "look at this." The laptop showed ground layers. Topsoil, clay, compacted earth from tornado debris, more clay. Then at 12.4 feet depth, a rectangular void. Clear structural edges, definitely man-made. That's not natural geology, Dr. Walsh said, adjusting settings for higher resolution. That's a constructed chamber, approximately 15 by 20 feet, height about 6 feet. Could it be an old foundation? Forgotten construction? Morrison asked, not wanting to jump to conclusions. At 12 feet depth? Possible but unlikely. Most basements are 8 feet maximum. Let me scan for density anomalies inside the void. He switched to bone detection mode. The screen lit up with bright signatures, multiple sources, clustered in various positions within the chamber. Dr. Walsh's face went pale. Sarah, those are human remains. Multiple individuals. I'm counting distinct signature clusters. At least 12, possibly more. Some are overlapping. Hard to distinguish. Morrison's heart pounded. She grabbed her phone, called Captain Rodriguez. We found them, all 14. They're here, underground. We need excavation equipment now. Within 2 hours, the site was secured. State police established perimeter. FBI agents arrived. Some who'd worked the original investigation in 2011, returning to finish what they'd started. Forensic teams with specialized excavation equipment. Media descended quickly. 10-year anniversary of the tornado. Major development in missing persons case. Potential criminal investigation. Helicopters circled overhead. News vans lined the roads outside. And the families came. Thomas Brennan, now 22, drove from Birmingham where he was attending college. Rachel Hoffman flew in from Tennessee. Susan Cho left work mid-shift. All 14 families converging on Oak Ridge, drawn by news that after a decade, their loved ones might finally come home. Excavation began that afternoon. Forensic archaeologists worked with painstaking care, removing soil layer by layer. Standard disaster recovery would use heavy equipment, backhoes, front loaders. But this was potentially a crime scene. Every layer might contain evidence. They had to work slowly. By evening, May the 1st, crews had cleared down 7 feet, exposed the top of a concrete structure, reinforced ceiling of the chamber, and a hatch, steel, sealed from above, reinforced with welded rebar. Detective Morrison photographed everything. This wasn't tornado damage. This was deliberate construction. Someone had built this chamber intentionally and sealed it thoroughly. Work continued under floodlights into the night. Cutting through the reinforced hatch took hours. Angle grinders, blow torches, careful work to avoid damaging potential evidence. At 9:47 p.m. on May 1st, 2021, crews finally cut through the seal. Morrison donned protective gear, hazmat suit, respirator, headlamp. She descended into the chamber first. The smell was faint after 10 years, but unmistakable. Death, decomposition, chemicals produced by body breakdown. Dry, not wet, the sealed environment had essentially mummified remains rather than allowing normal decay. Morrison's headlamp swept across the space. 14 skeletons. Some in clusters like they'd huddled together for comfort. Some alone in corners. Scattered clothing, faded but still identifying. Personal effects, wedding rings, watches, Bobby Jameson's cane, Sylvia's distinctive lavender print dress, and in the corner a leather journal, Dorothy Elkin's journal held clutched in skeletal hands where she'd died. Morrison climbed out of the chamber, removed her respirator, struggled to compose herself. The families were waiting at the police perimeter, desperate for information. She approached them, chose words carefully. "We found your loved ones. All 14. They're in an underground chamber beneath the maintenance shed. I'm so sorry, but they didn't survive." Reactions ranged. Some families collapsed in grief, relief mixed with renewed loss. Thomas Brennan just nodded numbly, like he'd known all along. Rachel Hoffman sobbed. Susan Cho stood silent, processing. But one question unified them. How did they get there? What happened? Morrison didn't have answers yet, but she would. Starting now, this became a homicide investigation. Forensic recovery took 3 days. Each skeleton carefully excavated, photographed in situ, removed with archaeological precision. Personal effects catalogued. Chamber walls examined for evidence. Fingerprints, tool marks, DNA. Dr. Patricia Huang, chief forensic pathologist for the state, arrived May 2nd. She descended into the chamber, examined remains in place before removal, made initial assessments. When she emerged, her expression was grim. She pulled Morrison aside. This wasn't a tornado death. This was murder. How can you tell? Multiple indicators. First, positioning. They didn't die suddenly from trauma. Bodies are in terminal positions, lying down, curled up, clustered for comfort. These people died slowly over days. Second, clothing and personal effects suggest they were trapped alive, conscious during the ordeal. Third, and this is critical, I found evidence of blunt force trauma on several skulls. Post-mortem injuries from debris would look different. These are peri-mortem injuries inflicted shortly before or around time of death. Morrison absorbed this. Someone killed them, then sealed them in here, or sealed them alive and let them die, Dr. Huang said, which is worse. Tell no more after full examination, but preliminary assessment. This was intentional homicide, multiple victims, premeditated. Forensic teams processed the chamber like the crime scene it was, scraped walls for DNA, collected soil samples, photographed tool marks on the concrete where the chamber had been constructed, examined the hatch mechanism, definitely sealed from above, no way to open from inside, and they found the trophies. Small items left deliberately, a cigarette lighter that didn't match any victim's possessions, a folding knife with initials MT engraved on the handle, a watch stopped at 8:47 p.m. on April 27, 2011. DNA analysis began immediately. Samples from each skeleton for identification via comparison to family members' DNA, but also forensic DNA under fingernails, on clothing, anywhere perpetrator might have left biological traces. By May 4th, preliminary DNA results returned. All 14 victims confirmed via dental records and DNA comparison. Identities certain, but foreign DNA was also present. Male, found on clothing fibers, on the murder weapon, a steel pipe discovered in the corner, under fingernails of 3 victims who'd apparently fought back. The DNA was run through CODIS, National Criminal Database. No hits. Perpetrator had no prior criminal record requiring DNA submission, so investigators turned to employment records. Riverside Meadows had required all employees to undergo background checks, including DNA collection, standard for healthcare facilities working with vulnerable populations. They ran the unknown DNA against the employee database from 2011. Match, Marcus Andrew Tully. Facility administrator. Detective Morrison immediately issued arrest warrant. Contacted FBI for assistance. Tully might have fled state, could be anywhere. It took FBI agents 6 hours to locate him. Marcus Tully, age 53 in 2021, living in Fort Myers, Florida, married in 2015 to a woman named Jennifer, stepfather to her 2 children, working as a healthcare consultant, advising nursing facilities on operational efficiency. He'd built an entirely new life. Nice house in a good neighborhood, respected in his field, active in his church, coached his stepson's Little League team. His wife had no idea who she'd married. FBI arrested Marcus Tully at his home on May 10, 2021, at 6:15 a.m. He answered the door in pajamas, coffee mug in hand, utterly shocked when agents identified themselves and read charges. 14 counts first-degree murder, kidnapping, fraud, embezzlement. "There's been a mistake," he said, face going pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Marcus Tully, you have the right to remain silent." His wife Jennifer came to the door, confused. "What's happening? Marcus, what are they talking about?" Tully said nothing, invoked his right to attorney, was handcuffed and taken into custody while his wife screamed questions no one would answer. Search of his Fort Myers home revealed the evidence that sealed his fate, a locked box in his garage hidden behind old paint cans. Inside, 14 items, 1 from each victim. Dorothy's reading glasses, Bobby's military service pin, Sylvia's lavender sachet, Linda's favorite pen. Small trophies taken before he sealed them in the chamber, each item tagged with a name and date, April 27, 2011. Marcus Tully had kept souvenirs, proof of his perfect crime. Except the crime hadn't been perfect after all. Extradition to Alabama took 2 weeks. Tully's attorney, high-powered defense lawyer from Miami, fought the transfer, argued procedural issues, delayed inevitably. But evidence was overwhelming. On May 24, 2021, Marcus Tully was transferred to Oak Ridge County Jail. The prosecution was prepared to seek death penalty. 14 premeditated murders of elderly, vulnerable victims. Aggravating circumstances, abuse of position, theft, use of natural disaster as cover. Alabama death penalty statute allowed prosecution for multiple murder, but Tully's attorney negotiated. In exchange for full confession detailing exactly what happened, prosecution would accept life without parole, no death penalty. Tully would die in prison, but by age and illness rather than execution. District attorney considered the offer, consulted with the families. Most wanted him dead, but several, including Thomas Brennan and Rachel Hoffman, said they just wanted truth, wanted to know exactly what happened to their loved ones in those final hours. "He'll die in prison either way," Thomas said. "I'd rather know what my grandmother experienced than watch him get an easy death by injection years from now." On May 30, 2021, Marcus Tully signed the confession agreement. On June 3, 2021, he gave his full statement, recorded, transcribed, witnessed by attorneys for both sides and all 14 families. The statement took 4 hours. Tully showed no emotion, spoke in flat, clinical tones, just recited facts like reading a grocery list. He'd started embezzling in September 2010, shortly after taking the administrator position. Gambling debts from his years in Tennessee had followed him to Alabama. He needed money desperately. Started small, overcharging for supplies, pocketing difference, then discovered he could order prescription painkillers, sell them to dealers in Birmingham for significant profit. Within months, he'd stolen $68,000 worth of medications. Dorothy Elkins noticed. She'd kept detailed records, compared delivery documentation to actual inventory. By March 2011, she'd accumulated enough evidence to report him to State Health Board. She'd told Caroline Webb in early April. Caroline promised to investigate. Tully overheard part of the conversation through his office door, realized his embezzlement was about to be exposed. He started planning immediately. Needed to eliminate Dorothy, destroy evidence, and do it in a way that seemed like accident or disaster. He couldn't just kill her. One suspicious death would trigger investigation. He needed chaos, multiple deaths, something that made Dorothy's death unremarkable. So he prepared the maintenance shed crawl space, spent weeks digging deeper, reinforcing walls, creating a chamber, told staff he was adding storage space, installing new electrical systems. No one questioned it, administrator's prerogative. By mid-April, the chamber was ready. He just needed the disaster. When the April 27th forecast showed high risk for violent tornadoes, Tully recognized his opportunity. He refined his target list. Dorothy absolutely as primary witness. James Dalton, dying anyway, terminal cancer. Death wouldn't seem unusual. Non-verbal patients like Albert Cho who couldn't report what happened. Dementia patients who wouldn't be believed if they tried to report. Severely ill patients whose deaths would seem natural. 14 total. Enough to bury Dorothy's death among other casualties. Small enough to be credible as tornado victims. When tornado warnings were issued April 27th, Tully executed his plan. Told Caroline to take 80 residents to the main shelter. He would handle 14 separately. Caroline questioned it, but complied. Crisis situation, administrator in charge, no time to argue. Tully gathered his 14 targets, led them to the maintenance shed, opened the crawlspace hatch, told them it was a shelter, they'd be safe there. Most trusted him. Some questioned, but tornado sirens were screaming. Fear overrode suspicion. All 14 descended into the chamber. Tully sealed the hatch from above, welded it shut with equipment he'd staged earlier, locked them in sealed chamber with no ventilation, no supplies, no escape. At 4:57 p.m., the tornado struck, destroyed the facility, scoured the maintenance shed down to bare earth. Perfect cover. Tully sheltered in a concrete drainage pipe he'd located earlier, far from the main shelter where he was supposed to be, but safe from tornado. When the storm passed, he emerged, returned to the property, helped with rescue efforts. No one questioned where he'd been or why he wasn't in the main shelter. Chaos was too complete. That night, after search and rescue teams left, Tully returned to the crawl space, unsealed the hatch partially, just enough to see inside with a flashlight. The 14 were still alive, trapped, terrified, begging for help. Tully descended into the chamber. This is where his confession became truly horrifying. Several family members left the room at this point, unable to hear more. Tully described in clinical detail how he killed each of the 14 over approximately 4 to 6 hours that night. Dorothy Elkins first. She'd recognized him when he descended, screamed accusations. He struck her with a steel pipe he'd brought, killed her quickly to silence her. Bobby Jameson fought back, former soldier, still strong despite age. He'd grabbed Tully, tried to restrain him. Tully struck him multiple times, 11 blunt force impacts to skull and torso before he went down. The others died more slowly. Some he strangled, easier, quieter. Patricia Rourke, Raymond Tucker, Harold Vance. Some he beat to death when they resisted. Eugene Morris, Constance Marshall, James Dalton, terminal cancer already weak. Tully simply withheld water and air, sealed him in a corner, let him suffocate and dehydrate over hours. Vernon Mills died from his emphysema in the sealed environment. Tully just watched. Sylvia, blind and disoriented. Tully strangled from behind. She never saw it coming. Linda Hoffman tried to reason with him, offered him money to let them go. He killed her mid-sentence. Albert Cho, non-verbal Alzheimer's, didn't understand what was happening. Tully described this death as easiest. No struggle, no screams, just confusion. Edith Sorensen was in violent dementia episode. Tully claimed she was dangerous. He had to kill her in self-defense. No one believed this. Lucille Hampton, wheelchair-bound, brittle bones. Tully broke her neck with his hands. By midnight, April 27th, all 14 were dead. Tully took his trophies, one item from each victim. Then he sealed the chamber permanently, poured concrete mix over the hatch, buried it under rubble, ensured it would never be found accidentally. He washed the blood off in what remained of the facility's water system, burned his clothes, left no evidence connecting him to the scene. Over the following days, he played the devastated administrator, helped with searches, knowing they'd never find the chamber at 12 feet depth, gave statements to police, described the fictional storm room, maintained his cover. When death certificates were issued in early May 2011, Tully felt safe. He'd succeeded. Perfect murder. He left Oak Ridge in August 2011, moved to Florida, started new life, met Jennifer, married her, became stepfather to her kids. 8 years of normalcy. "I thought I'd gotten away with it," Tully said flatly at the end of his confession. "For 10 years I did. How did you find them?" Detective Morrison showed him Caroline Webb's letter, anonymous, postmarked Birmingham. Tully read it, then looked up. Caroline, it had to be Caroline Webb, she suspected. I could see it in her eyes after the tornado, but she could never prove anything. She finally couldn't live with herself anymore. "No," Morrison said. "She couldn't. Unlike you, she has a conscience." Tully shrugged. "Conscience is expensive. I had debts to pay." That was the final statement. No remorse, no apology. Just cold calculation explaining why 14 elderly people had to die so he could erase gambling debts. The confession was played for the families. Most couldn't finish listening. The clinical descriptions of their loved ones' final moments, too much to bear. Thomas Brennan made it through, heard how his grandmother Sylvia died. Strangled from behind while blind, disoriented, calling for him. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for several minutes. Then, "At least we know now. At least she's not just missing anymore. We can bury her properly." The funerals happened in June 2021. 14 caskets, this time containing actual remains. DNA-confirmed identities. Proper burials after a decade. Oak Ridge Cemetery held a mass service. Entire town attended. 14 graves side by side, each with proper headstones now listing accurate death information. Dorothy Elkins, 1932-2011. Beloved principal and friend, taken by evil, not nature. Robert Jameson, 1928-2011. Korean War veteran, fought until the end. 14 similar inscriptions, all acknowledging the truth they'd been murdered, not killed by tornado. Caroline Webb attended anonymously, standing at the back of the cemetery. She'd come forward after Tully's arrest, admitted writing the letter, given statements to police. The family's reactions to Caroline varied. Some blamed her for staying silent 10 years. Others praised her for finally speaking up. Thomas Brennan approached her after the service. "Thank you," he said simply. "You gave me my grandmother back. I can grieve properly now." Caroline sobbed. "I should have said something in 2011. I should have—" "You said something when it mattered," Thomas interrupted. "That's what counts." Other families weren't as forgiving. Barbara Morris, Eugene's daughter, confronted Caroline. "You suspected for 10 years and said nothing. My father spent those years listed as tornado victim. You could have exposed the truth." Caroline didn't defend herself, just accepted the anger, the blame. She deserved it. The prosecution kept Caroline's identity confidential from media, protected her as witness and source, but word leaked eventually. By July 2021, her name was public. She lost her job. School board felt her delayed reporting showed poor judgment. Her marriage struggled. David supported her, but the stress was overwhelming. Caroline entered therapy, diagnosed with severe PTSD and survivor's guilt. She attended support groups for people who'd failed to report crimes they'd witnessed. She volunteered with elder abuse prevention organizations, spent years trying to atone. "I saved no one," she told her therapist. "I just told the truth 10 years too late. If I'd spoken up in 2011, they might have found the chamber sooner. They might have survived." Her therapist tried to explain. "You were afraid. Financial pressure, job security, family obligations. Fear kept you silent. That's human. You're not responsible for Tully's crimes." But Caroline never fully believed that. The guilt remained, permanent weight she'd carry forever. Marcus Tully pleaded guilty on June 15, 2021. 14 counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, fraud, embezzlement. Sentenced to 14 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Currently incarcerated at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. His wife Jennifer divorced him within weeks of his arrest. Changed her last name back to her maiden name, changed her children's names. Moved away from Fort Myers, tried to rebuild life away from media attention. Tully has had no visitors since incarceration, no mail, no phone calls. His family disowned him. His stepchildren refused contact. Even his attorney stopped communicating after trial concluded. He sits in maximum security cell, 23-hour lockdown. Other inmates know what he did. Killing elderly people in a nursing home is considered particularly heinous, even among criminals. He's been attacked 3 times, requires protective custody. He'll die in prison. Old, alone, forgotten. That's the justice the families wanted. What happened at Riverside Meadows led to systematic changes in disaster preparedness and elder care. Alabama passed the Riverside 14 Act in 2022, mandatory RFID tracking for all residents during emergency evacuations. Every resident gets a wrist tag that logs location during sheltering. If someone ends up separated from the main group, alarms trigger immediately. Federal regulations now require dual administrator approval for any shelter-in-place decisions during disasters. One person can't unilaterally separate vulnerable populations anymore. Mandatory post-disaster roll calls. Every facility must account for every resident within 2 hours of disaster passing. If anyone is unaccounted for, immediate search protocols activate. Building codes were updated. All new elderly care facilities must have architectural transparency. No hidden chambers, no secret spaces, no construction that isn't fully documented and inspected. Enhanced background checks for all healthcare administrators, including financial audits, credit checks, gambling history. Anyone with significant debt is flagged for additional monitoring. Regular financial audits of facilities. State health boards now conduct surprise audits quarterly, checking medication inventories, supply orders, financial records. The kind of embezzlement Tully got away with would be caught within weeks now. Most importantly, presumption of foul play in disaster missing persons cases. Tornadoes can destroy bodies, but when bodies don't turn up after thorough searches, investigators now assume alternative explanations. Ground-penetrating radar is now standard protocol, scanning deeper than disaster debris typically settles. If the Riverside 14 rules had existed in 2011, Marcus Tully's plan would have failed at multiple points. RFID tracking would have flagged the 14 separated residents. Dual approval would have prevented the separation. Deeper GPR scans would have found the chamber within days. But those rules didn't exist then. 14 people died because a single administrator had too much power, too little oversight, and perfect opportunity provided by a tornado. The memorial at Riverside Meadows was rebuilt in 2022. The 14 names are still there, but now with additional information. Murdered April 27, 2011, justice served 2021. Every April 27th the families still gather, but now they gather with closure, with bodies properly buried, with a killer behind bars, with knowledge of exactly what happened. Thomas Brennan comes every year, brings fresh lavender, places it on his grandmother Sylvia's grave, stands in silence for several minutes, then usually says the same thing. Miss you, Graham. At least you're home now. Rachel Hoffman brings flowers to her mother Linda's grave. Reads the last letter Linda wrote, the one about storms coming, and not to worry because the shelter was safe. You were wrong, Mom, Rachel whispers, but you couldn't have known. The families have formed a support group, the Riverside 14 Foundation. They advocate for elder protection, disaster preparedness, abuse prevention. They give talks at nursing facilities, warning staff to watch for signs of administrative misconduct. They've raised $400,000 for elder care improvements across Alabama. Our loved ones died for nothing, Thomas said at a foundation meeting in 2023, just for one man's gambling debts and ego. But we can make their deaths mean something. We can save others. That's what Dorothy would have wanted. She spent her life teaching people to do better. We'll honor her by continuing that work. The tornado itself, the actual EF4 that struck Oak Ridge on April 27, 2011, killed 33 people across its 47-mile track. 47 other people died in other tornadoes across Alabama that day. 247 total deaths statewide. Tornadoes are natural disasters, terrible but not evil. They destroy without malice, kill without intent. Nature's violence. But 14 of those deaths weren't natural. 14 were murder. Marcus Tully weaponized chaos, used nature's destruction as cover for calculated homicide, turned a disaster into opportunity. For 10 years he succeeded, lived free, built new life, convinced himself he'd committed the perfect crime. But truth has a way of emerging. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it requires someone's conscience to break, someone who couldn't live with silence anymore. Caroline Webb carried guilt for a decade before finally speaking up. Her letter, 5 sentences, anonymous, postmarked Birmingham, solved a case investigators had closed as unsolvable, found 14 people who'd been missing for 10 years, brought families closure, sent a murderer to prison. One voice, one letter, 10 years late. But it mattered. That's the lesson of Riverside Meadows. Not just about disaster preparedness or elder protection, but about speaking up, about conscience, about how silence can cost lives, but truth, even delayed truth, can bring justice. Dorothy Elkins wrote in her journal for years, documenting evidence of crimes. She spoke up, tried to report what she'd discovered. Marcus Tully killed her to keep her silent, but Dorothy's journal survived. Found in the chamber, clutched in skeletal hands where she died. Her documentation helped convict Tully. Her final act, holding on to evidence, ensured justice eventually came. Caroline Webb stayed silent for 10 years, fear of consequences, of being wrong, of losing her job. But guilt finally overcame fear. She wrote the letter. She spoke up. And 14 families finally got to bring their loved ones home. Before we wrap up, I need to hear from you. Comment below with where you're watching from and tell me, could you have stayed silent as long as Caroline did? It's easy to judge, harder to honestly answer what you'd do in that impossible situation. And don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Stories like this need to be told, and your support makes sure I can keep investigating cases like these. April 27, 2011 was a natural disaster that killed 247 people in Alabama. But 14 of those deaths were different. 14 were murdered, and for 10 years their killer walked free believing he'd succeeded. He was wrong. Truth won. Eventually, truth always wins. The tornado destroyed buildings. Marcus Tully destroyed innocence. But Caroline Webb, flawed and haunted and 10 years late, restored something more important than buildings. She restored hope. Even in darkness, even after years of silence, one voice speaking truth can change everything. That's the legacy of the Riverside 14. Not just tragedy, not just murder, but the lesson that it's never too late to speak up, never too late for truth, never too late for justice. Their graves are marked now, their names known, their deaths acknowledged, their home. And Marcus Tully will die in prison, forgotten and alone, exactly as he deserves. That's justice. Delayed by a decade, but justice nonetheless.